Okay. Theoretically, we're live on Facebook now. Yeah. So it'll bring us on for people in a minute or so, but we are recording the Facebook Live. And so this is Wild Theology with Phil Wyman, and this guy over here with the as John called it, the Bruce Willis head. He's awesome. And that's Kyle. All right, he's got the gun too. It's Christmas time, so you are all the more popular in your look, bro. This is Kyle Jones, and Kyle and I go, man, we go back a ways.
Really back.
Yeah. So
probably about 20 years.
Yeah. And Kyle came into Salem when I just a couple of years after I started pastoring a church there, and we started something called the Dead Philosophers Society together, and that was an absolute blast. You were such a moving force in that thing. That was a kick.
I felt like it was the Dead Poet Society, but like more realistic.
Exactly. Yeah.
And nobody died at the end. So
yeah, but well, philosophers, poets, poets just lie with beautiful words. Philosophers lie with big words.
There you go.
and John Morehead. So for those of you who have seen some of the stuff that I've done before, you've probably seen John as a part of it, because John and I have been involved in various ways getting in trouble or causing trouble. So So John is the head of a group called Multifaith Matters, and the religious diplomacy group, I can never remember the full name of it. It's kind of big.
Yeah. It's called the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, and because that is so unwieldy, that's why we go with Multifaith Matters. So there you go.
Okay, there we go. And so Kyle, you I don't think I've ever asked you specifically the doctoral work you were doing in Glasgow. When you were in Salem, you had done your master's at Gordon Conwell, correct?
No, I transferred to Boston University.
Okay, started at Gordon Conwell, transferred to BU. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you went to Glasgow, and so tell us a little bit about what you've done, and then you're inviting atheists to church.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just a brief summary. I'm a former conservative evangelical Christian. Was a youth pastor for many years. I went off and did, furthered my education beginning at a graduate level seminary. You had mentioned Gordon Conwell.
Right.
And then I transferred to Boston University, where I got both my master's degrees. During that time in grad school, that's when I started going through this period of doubt and wondering if I actually believed the doctrines that I believed, whether God existed or whether the Bible was God's word or whether there was an afterlife or any of these things. They started to,
right.
Become an issue to me intellectually and personally. And so, I didn't really ever have a moment. People talk about like a mountaintop experience, like Martin Luther would say.
Right.
I didn't have a moment of deconversion to becoming an atheist. It was a couple year process. But yes, and just shortly, I went off to the University of Glasgow to do a PhD in philosophy program.
Right.
I taught moral and political philosophy to undergrads there, but it became too expensive. And let's just say you have quite a bit of lager in the noontime in Scotland, so it tends to mess with your productivity. So I was there for a year and a half, and I just kind of couldn't afford it and flew back to the States.
Okay, and now you're in Arizona.
Now I'm in this burning hellhole called Phoenix, which is nice. It's nice right now, but about 7 months out of the year, it's quite literally hell.
Right.
So yeah.
I understand that. I was sent to Phoenix back in '85. Foursquare Church wanted me to consider taking a church in Arizona somewhere, and had us driving all over during a time when there was this unbelievable heat wave. And we had a car with no air conditioning, and Elijah was about 6 months old. It was brutal. It was absolutely brutal.
Yeah, it is.
I didn't feel the calling. I ended up in Carlsbad, California.
Oh, that's interesting, huh?
It just so happened you didn't feel the calling, right?
Well,
Convenient.
There were some interesting places like Globe.
Oh,
There was this church in Globe that looked like Martin Luther had nailed his theses onto the door, and it was a town of about 500 at the time with a history of 5,000. So, but yeah, didn't end up there. So, John, just kind of give us a quick view of things you're doing right now.
Let's see. You've already mentioned that I'm part of Multifaith Matters. That began as a grant team that Phil and some other team members were a part of, and we brought theology of multi-faith encounters into conversation with social psychology and a little social neuroscience and strategic storytelling and all that kind of thing. And I'm still working on trying to develop strategies and unpack what that looks like so that we can help evangelical Christians and other Christians deal with our tendency towards negative and even prejudicial feelings and actions towards other religions and atheists as well. And so a part of that the last few months, we've been taking advantage positively of the pandemic and expanding our podcast library in audio and video forms and trying to plan out what 2021 is going to look like. And that's involved a lot of interesting and fascinating conversations like the one we're having today. So I will note that I have had conversations with a few atheists over the years in public forums. Years ago at Utah Valley University, they had an interfaith conference, and I was having an exchange with an atheist. I'm going to space on his name, but he's the author of Theist. Have you ever seen that book, Kyle?
Yeah, his name is Chris Stedman. I've met him. He's a lovely man. Yeah,
and from what I know is he got a lot of strong pushback for his work from the atheist community. I think he got out of the interfaith thing, if memory serves, because of that negative response. So he and I had a public conversation. More recently, I had a conversation and have done some work, some podcasting and co-authoring with Stephen Bradford Long, who's an atheist and a member of the Satanic Temple. And so that has been a fascinating kind of thing. So I haven't done a whole lot of dialogue with atheists, but I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah. So in terms of religious movement in your life, John, you started life in the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right?
Yeah, I will say that actually before that, we were, I'm originally from Northern California, now living in Utah. And for the first years growing up, we were agnostic. We just didn't talk about religion, didn't go to church, none of that stuff. I was always interested in spirituality in a sense. I mean, I loved watching paranormal documentaries on television, and there is that spiritual undercurrent in some aspects of the paranormal. In fact, I've continued to do some academic work looking at the paranormal as a spiritual phenomenon for some people. But that was there, but we had a family connection to the Reorganized Latter-day Saints, and that is now known as the Community of Christ, headquartered in Independence, Missouri. A lot of people aren't familiar with that group. They know the Mormon Church or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and headquartered in Salt Lake City. But what they don't know is after the death of the founder, Joseph Smith Jr., a group followed Emma Smith, Joseph's wife, and they eventually settled in Independence. And so they've got this interesting dynamic of both claiming to be the one true church. And because of that family connection, I eventually got baptized and was a member of that for a handful of years. But then I read some material critical of Mormonism in general and just had questions, a credibility problem and a faith crisis and that kind of thing. But I was still interested in Jesus as a historical figure and historical Christianity. And So I eventually ended up gravitating towards that. And I would consider myself an evangelical Christian in general, but I think a different kind of evangelical. Some of the views I held early on in my faith walk, I no longer hold. I think those have improved and modified. So I'm trying to be a think out of the box, self-critical kind of evangelical, and these dialogues and these conversations are a part of that. So yeah, I've had that faith journey, and I've also had the opportunity to study the academic literature on what that process is all about.
Right. And you've had, Kyle, you've had few movements in faith, non-faith, and
Oh, sure. Like when I first converted to Christianity at age 17, I started in a Pentecostal church, as you know. It was an Assemblies of God church, right? And then moved to Foursquare. But then when I started getting more into biblical doctrine, I don't know, I've always kind of been one of those people that overthinks and reads too much. I remember going to church with like my Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, my Tao Te Ching, my History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, and my ESV Bible, and I would get these looks like, what the hell is this youth pastor, doing with all this stuff?
Right.
And but I eventually became a Reformed Christian, so I became a Calvinist. Right. Which, the pretentious Calvinists always are like, well, look, this is where intellectualism in Christianity will lead you, right? They love studying, the Westminster Confessions, the Synod of Dort, the 95 Thesis, all this historical, the patristics from Augustine on. So I became a Reformed Christian. And then I started, like I said, just studying other world religions, other different philosophical perspectives, science. And that's when I started slowly becoming an atheist. Now, when I first became an atheist, I was a firebrand atheist, right? I felt like I had been conned and duped, right? And so I felt like I needed to kind of vent that frustration towards religious folks as if they're basically the antipathy of goodness and enlightenment. Like they're all these horrible people, right? Since then, I feel like I've matured a little bit in that sense, in which now I'm really a kind of jovial, I do interfaith work. I'm the only atheist on the board of directors for an interfaith organization called Interfaith Alliance. I also started interviewing atheists at Church Day, which you can look up all the YouTube videos on that. I've done a bunch of those interviews myself. I know you led one as well a while back, Phil, in Salem. So there's a bunch of interviewing atheists at Church Day stuff, and that was supposed to humanize atheists to church-going and religious persons, and then humanize religious persons and pastors and church-going people to atheists. So I'm a wimpy atheist. I don't believe that a deity exists, but I believe the best thing that we can do is try to find those unique and strange connections and ways in which we can be pragmatic and work together.
Can I add a PS to my comments in light of what Kyle just said, Phil? I also should add to my story. When I came out of Reorganized Latter-day Saints, it wasn't this happy, great, I found something new. I really appreciate what I was involved in the past. I went through that angry period. I was deceived. I was misled. That's part of the evangelical reconversion narrative, that you've escaped the satanic lie and now you're in the truth. And we can, evangelicals can have a theological debate about it, but the reality is I was angry and I gravitated towards what's called a counter-cult approach. That's really heavy on worldview apologetics and basically trying to annihilate the worldview of the other, even as an evangelistic approach, supposedly, where if I tell you that all your stuff is unbiblical and it's wrong, then somehow that's going to warm your heart to embrace what I understand to be Christianity. And so I went through that period and had to go through, this stuff is all a journey. And as a part of my journey, I started studying cross-cultural missions and sociology of religion. And it just kind of changed my perspective. I even, so-called heretics through the history of the church, I used to, as a counter-cult person, I would say, these were evil people trying to foist, unbiblical teachings on the masses. I think these so-called heretics are people grappling with trying to understand the Bible and who Christ was, and they came to very different kinds of conclusions than what would eventually become the orthodoxy of the day. And so I've softened quite a bit on my understanding, my approach, and conversation. I would also note that Kyle mentioned the need to humanize. In Pew surveys of how people feel about other religious traditions, evangelicals have some of the lowest and coldest feelings about other religious traditions of any other group. And at the bottom rung of groups that we don't like are Muslims, and below them are atheists. And so we definitely, in the evangelical tribe, need to have these kinds of conversations so that we don't have to agree, but we need to rehumanize those people that we have these poor feelings about and often react to in prejudicial kinds of ways.
So I just had to do something on Facebook. I'm kind of letting you guys know here that something had occurred where it reset the setting on me, and it went private, and I had to make it public. People were saying, "Hey, where are you?" so now people are popping in. Anyway, so for those of you who are just popping in now and seeing this. This is John W. Morehead from Multifaith Matters and Kile Jones, and we're talking about the movement of conversion in and out of religion, across religion. And Kyle had just described some of his, which if you want to go back and look at it, this can be reviewed afterwards. It'll save onto Facebook, and then we'll put it on YouTube. And Kyle talked about his movement into Christianity as a Pentecostal, then to a Reformed theology as a Christian, and then to atheism, and initially kind of an angry atheism, right, Kyle?
Yes.
You deceived me, you. and boy, that's understandable.
Well, yeah, and here's the thing about that too, is that I don't want to be pretentious and act like I said matured earlier, as if, I've angry atheists are adolescents. And I don't want to imply that. But, because I feel like there is a sense in which when you feel duped and conned, and when you look around and you worry about things like the theocratic impulse, right? When you see religion and government joining forces, when you worry about how people are using the Bible and their understanding of Christianity to marginalize LGBT people, or right. you name it, right? Then it gives impetus to that firebrand atheist. Obviously, there's a reason that we were there, right? I mean, it's a natural response, right, to the fears of these kind of things. I just think I instead of matured, sometimes I use the word I'm more refined, like I'm some kind of food or wine, So yeah, I'm a little more refined, I think. And
who's the guy who has the blog? I think it's called The Gentle Atheist.
Oh, are you talking about The Friendly Atheist?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, The Friendly Atheist.
Hemant Mehta.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably even more friendly than he is. I would agree. As far as engaging with and kind of accepting religious difference, but yeah, I'm a little nicer now.
Well, and it particularly, I can imagine there's a lot of people struggling with wanting to move from where they've been religiously to a new place because they're looking at the politics of the American evangelical during the season of Trump. There's all kinds of transition happening. It's happening within the people who are maintaining their position within evangelicalism, and people who are like, I don't know what to do with this anymore. So I think conversion is a big topic at the moment, because we're going through it. We're all changing. We're converting in some way inside. So I'll just kind of throw it out for myself. So the only church experience I had when I was young was pretty much with my grandmother, who took me to the Christian Science Church. So, something that was called the mother of the New Age movement. And so that was my theological background. And then through high school into early college, the movement was toward an atheism. And then for me, I had this radical experience, which you have to call these things subjective, but it was on close to a miracle-like level that I didn't initially say, oh, I have to follow this Jesus thing because this happened. I actually took like weeks saying, wow, that was totally bizarre and I don't know what to do with it, except if it's true, I've got to give my life to it wholly. And so that was my conversion into Christianity. And I suppose you could say there's been a variety of conversions. One of them, when you get excommunicated from a denomination for doing what you think you're supposed to be doing and being called a heretic, you kind of have an internal conversion of some kind. But for me, it was something like, now I read Paul differently. Like, he was the guy who was, living in a pagan empire. And I read him as having to struggle with that, and I was doing that. And then he gets beat up by his own people, right? So, I started seeing that story differently. It didn't make me non-Pentecostal, but it did make me rethink a lot of dynamics of Christianity. So, that's kind of where I come from. Let's just kind of talk through this thing of conversion and what was going on inside of us while we were walking through some of the things that occurred. And inside of us has to do with what's going on the outside, who's talking to us, who's frustrating us, betraying us, loving us, all the dynamics of interpersonal relationships. So that's been noted as one of the primary things that happens in the conversion experience for most individuals, is that friends, family, relationship tend to be a part of that. But then there's also, and I think the three of us kind of hit this, there's an intellectual component that we struggle with. I just love reading books. Other people go, what is that? So, I have that heady dynamic. So what was going on inside?
I'll leave this to John.
Oh, okay. First, let me just say, this is a huge and complex and multifaceted subject. And one of the things is, how do you define conversion, right? Phil, you mentioned the Apostle Paul, and I, like most people, assumed that he had a conversion experience, but I was watching this fascinating conversation between Tom Holland, who's a historian, and one of his recent books is called Dominion, looking at the influence of Christianity on Western culture and its values and so on. And he was having a conversation with N.T. Wright, and they were stumbled into Wright's biography of Paul.
Yeah.
And Wright said that contrary to our assumptions, that Paul really didn't have a conversion experience per se, as we usually think of it, going from one religion to another or from religion to a religion. Right. He was still a Second Temple Jew, and he worshiped the God of Israel, but his understanding of who that God was and who Jesus was in the mix, that was his change. And then his letters and everything else were trying to unpack, what in the heck does this mean, my prior understanding, in light of this experience that I've had. And so that illustrates, I think the conversion process is a mess and a mix. It is. Evangelicals like to think of supernatural element, right? God zaps you and you have that change, and there you go. And I don't want to.
I love how you use the word zap, because it's totally appropriate.
Yeah. I think it's a little more difficult than that. Like Rodney Stark, in his book on the rise of Christianity, he looks at the sociological aspects of why did Christianity take off and grow like it did. And in his introduction, he says, I'm not trying to take away from the possibility of anything supernatural, but we also have to look at the social, the relational, the emotional. There's a whole lot of stuff going on there. And so for me, in my experience, coming out of Reorganized Latter-day Saints, it was a social context that got me into it with a family connection through my grandmother. And then when I got into high school, I was dating a young lady who would eventually become my ex-wife, who was a Southern Baptist. And so I started reading material from that perspective that was critical of the origins of Mormonism and that kind of thing. So it was a mix of intellectual concerns, changing social contexts, and those kinds of things. And I would say that even after my so-called conversion to Orthodox Christianity, it was still a struggle, in that my thinking was, gosh, if I accepted this one worldview and came to think it was false, maybe this Christianity thing isn't. How do we know anything? And so I really grab onto that verse in the Bible, Lord, I believe. I'll quote the King James, help thou mine unbelief. There's a tension there. And I think if we're honest, we all have to recognize with humility that we embrace worldviews, and whether they're religious or non-religious, but we need to hold those with conviction, but also with humility at the same time, because there's so much that we don't know. So be willing, wherever you're coming from, to kind of reassess and rethink. And as you talk to others that you vigorously disagree with and think they're wrong in their worldview selection and their conversion, be careful how you do that, because it's a messy process.
Too true. So yeah, you jumped in with that word zapped for a second there, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the idea that, like, in Christianity, conversion is like punctiliar, like it happens at one point in time, right? And then it's like a black and white, stark contrast, kind of evil, fallen soul to boom, a second later, born again, right? It just totally, one step to another. And I appreciate how John mentions that it's a lot more complex than that. It definitely is more complex. Even if you have, like you said, a kind of miraculous or what I would say like a really radical experience, even then you're still left to sort of look back, ex post facto, and try to understand what that whole thing meant. For me, one thing I want to highlight with this conversion or deconversion thing is that a lot of it is intellectual, for sure. Absolutely. It's about, worldview, philosophy of life, how you understand the universe and everything around you. But a lot of it are issues of identity, right? Where do you locate yourself in the world? How do you identify, or your various identities, right? And then when those identities start to rupture, when they start to break apart, when they start to collapse, then you're left in this like liminal space where you have anxiety. You don't know who you really are, right? You're stuck in this sort of just this. I always think of C.S. Lewis's. He called it like the woods in between. In I think Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I believe. I forget. It's called the woods in between, but it's like this place where you start to like kind of forget who you are, and it kind of has that issue. So a lot of it is about being able to identify who you are, because your identity is connected to your values, your sense of meaning, your sense of purpose, your sense of existential security. And when that falls apart, it's really a troubling and can be difficult position that you're in, right? I mean, you have a dysmorphia, so I think that's a big part of this conversion or deconversion process, is that a lot of it has to do with how you locate yourself in the world, how you identify, and how you navigate the situations around you.
Right. I know this particular dynamic of it is different for everybody, but there's an element of that identity, which is some of it is self-driven and internal, but a great degree of it is community-driven. It's relational. It has to do with the people who are around us, and so studies on conversion. In fact, there were some early studies now about 15 years ago, even on the movement from theism to atheism, that showed that many of the dynamics were similar, going in both directions, whether you were going from atheism to theism, theism to atheism. Many of the dynamics were similar, and to a great degree, community was an element of it, that the circle of people you were around were influencing factors that brought about change. And for myself, there was an interesting dynamic because I had this zap. Actually, it's more specific to me, the slap experience. Because I had two moments in which it seemed quite evident to me that I was slapped across the face by an invisible hand. My head jerked, words pop into my head about the crucifixion of Christ and its impact in my life. And, what happens after I feel the sensation, think something's coming at me, feel a sensation, snap of a head, and these words pop in my head. Then I struggle with that for a while to discover whether it's true. I start going to church with a group of people I'm going to school with, studying music. And within a short period of time, probably a year and a half, some pretty crazy things start to happen where I'm accused of being a heretic. It was going to be the process of my entire life. Actually, I was accused of being demon possessed, so it wasn't quite as bad as a heretic. And there was nothing about that moment that changed my faith, despite my community around me was beginning to dissolve some. But my faith and my sense of conversion to Christ and commitment to it didn't change. And I wonder to what degree that was the case, because I felt like my experience of religion was to a great degree personally experienced without human intervention. It came from somewhere else. It wasn't a person who did it or said it or convinced me. It was something that occurred to me, and whether that was, people can say it's all a subjective experience, or it really was an external thing. There's all kinds of ways of looking at this. Was I on drugs? I wasn't. But social dynamics changing didn't change my commitment. Changed certain elements of certainly my theology or my views on community, but something about my way in to my Christianity anchored me for those moments of difficulty with community. And I know it's different for each of us, that those community dynamics affect us in different ways.
Yeah, I have a question for John. Did your grandmother and that side of the family, did they view you negatively after this? Did you have family repercussions or anything like that?
My grandmother was like a planet with a extremely strong gravitational pull, and that's how we got into RLDS. And when I came out, there was this is the sad thing. There was tension, but I exacerbated the tension because of self-righteousness. I mean, I went through, and this is a part of that deconversion, reconversion dynamic. There's a psychological process where you feel like you've been burned. And I kind of liken it to going through a divorce process where, man, I fell in love with this person and thought this is going to be it. And they turned out to be A, B, and C. And not only do I hate her, but I maybe even hate women. I'm never going to get married again. And then some people get stuck in that psychological place. But most people work through it and then all right, it was a bad experience, but hopefully I've matured and learned some lessons, and you end up in another relationship and hopefully things work out better. And I think a similar dynamic goes on in deconversion. We get so angry, and then we're narrative creatures. We tell ourselves stories wherever we go. And then we look back on that experience and we tell ourselves a new story. And so, that group was evil. And then our social context then helps pad and shape that new story. And that's why I'll speak for evangelicalism, you see the ex-member format for talking about other religious traditions are so popular. A book by a former Mormon who's exposing the teachings of Mormonism. A former atheist tells us why, they're all godless and relativists and all this. And we just eat that up because not only do we appreciate that experience, it confirms now that we're in the right place and the right truth. But for some reason, we also think that former member was then an expert in the totality of the system they were involved in, when in reality, they were an expert in their own experience, but not necessarily. They can't speak. A former Buddhist can't tell us everything we need to know about Buddhism, for Pete's sake, but we invest it with such authority. So again, these are a part of the intellectual and social and narrative dynamics that go into it. So I made my own family dynamic worse because of my zeal and for the newfound truth. And then I actually ended up spoiling and harming those family relationships. It took several years to correct. So that was my experience.
Wow.
I can sympathize with that. I feel like I don't know where to place the barometer or, even to do such a thing looking back as far as who to blame, because I have these really bad stories of, friends that I'd had for 10 years kind of disowning me, not wanting me to poison their well, the biblical verse about not being equally yoked together, right, with unbelievers. That was constantly used when I was like, guys, I don't know if I believe this stuff anymore. I had pastor friends of mine disown me. I've had, everything. Obviously, atheism has a huge stigma placed on it, right? We're immoral. We don't have ethics. We don't care about civic engagement. We don't raise our children well. We don't treat people well. We're nihilists, and we're the least trusted group. Absolutely. So, so you get your morality challenged. You get all of this challenge, but then I have these Christian friends of mine who have stuck by me and have been like, look, if I'm going to be true to myself, I'm going to love you no matter where you end up going. You're not out to poison me. This is just where you're going to go, and I'll support you where you go. And so it's been like there's positive and negative social responses that I've experienced.
Right. And that transfer was happening within the context of seminary, right?
Yeah.
That's a tough place to have that happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, where I'm going to basically train myself to be a full-time pastor is it does the exact opposite. It ends up challenging all of my previously held notions and conceptions about what Christianity was or where I was. So it kind of did the opposite. But I think once again, with all of this, whether it's someone going from Mormonism to a different form of Christianity, or Pentecostalism to being Reformed, or Reformed to being Wesleyan, or whatever, I think like the main point here is that, people need to be handled with grace. They need to be handled with compassion. And the more that we can learn to, enact that when other people are going through transitions, I think the better people we are.
So I'm gonna drop back to the thought about identity, because there's a comment here from Andrew Thomas, friend of mine from Wales. He says, yes, the conflict is identity. We are obsessed with, quote, me. This is a natural, innate human instinct. We are Homo sapiens first. Spiritualism introduces conflict. So does Is it the fact that spirituality doesn't bring conflict to us? What do you think about that, guys?
I'll leave it to John.
I don't think it's just spirituality or religion. I mean, I hear that a lot from some atheists, right? If we could just get rid of religion, we wouldn't have this violence. We wouldn't have, the warfare, and science and reason will triumph. I don't
Imagine all the people.
Yeah. For me, I agree with social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. I think human beings aren't so much rational creatures who have occasional emotional moments. We're emotional and intuitional creatures who have occasional rational moments. And I think our conflict is going to happen regardless of whether it's spirituality or a secular ideology or whatever. We disagree with each other. We have identities. We're tribal creatures by nature. We prefer the in-group and we're suspicious of the out-group, and we tend to demonize the out-group. And that has been on full display in America, especially over the last 4 years in the political realm, but also in the interreligious realm. And so we need to figure out not how to stop fighting, in my view, but fight better, argue better, rehumanize others. These are important issues we're talking about, so we should be arguing about them, but we need to argue better and have better conversations.
Right.
And recognize that balance between the emotions and the rational component and address both as we try and have these conversations.
Yeah.
I also just want to throw another wrench into here, is that as much as I want to be jovial and hold hands and get along with everybody, there's just a sad fact of the world that there are like actual zero-sum ideologies out there that simply will not allow for difference. They're pro persecuting physically, emotionally, you name it, people who disagree. So I also want to reiterate that not all beliefs are the same. Some tend to lend themselves to better ways of acting in the world, and some lend themselves to more negative ways of acting in the world. For instance,
right.
If you have a belief that that a Black person is 3/5 of a human being, like, I don't care who believes that, it's false and hazardous and leads to negative actions. So we can't act like all beliefs are on par with each other, right? So when you talked about being raised in Christian or having encounters with Christian Science, for instance, so when I was reading Mary Baker Eddy's Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, I started thinking, because there's this sort of Gnostic element where
Absolutely.
material reality, physical ailments, diseases, viruses, and all that stuff has to do with the fact that you're actually not connected enough with the divine mind, right? And so it's a spiritual thing. It's not a physical, material thing that's happening to you. And then you get these sick children that are not getting antibiotics or receiving medical treatment when they're sick. And so there's a belief right there where, as much as I want to be like, hey, my Christian Science neighbor, let's be friends, I can't help but say that belief is false and hazardous.
Right. If they take it that far.
Yeah.
Which in actuality, it was very few who did.
Yeah.
But they ended up in court cases, in the 60s and the 80s. There were court cases about these things.
Yeah, I would agree with Kyle, and I would add my 2 cents to that and say there are some ideologies like white supremacy and neo-Nazis and so on, where it's hard to find much of value at all, and we have to recognize that. But at the same time, there are religious traditions, whether Christianity, Islam, what have you. We have to be careful and recognize differences. Religion, to me, is not an essentialist thing out there objectively. Religion is as it is lived. And therefore, we have to look at the diversity of expressions. And some expressions of Christianity are great, and some aren't so great. Some expressions of Islam are great, and some are extremist. And so we have to recognize that some elements in certain ideologies are very problematic, as in white supremacy. But then with other traditions, it can be a continuum. And we have to take people where they are and try and help people, when they can, tap into the best of their ideology or religious tradition to try and make this the best. We're going to disagree, but let's try and have the best public square that we can to work together for the common good.
Somebody wants to know what made you lose your faith, Kyle. It's Alan Henniger from LA, friend of mine.
Okay. Losing it as if like I lost my wallet. This goes back into how we frame things, right? So
right.
Some atheists might respond to that and say, I didn't lose anything, I gained something, right?
Right.
Like I had mentioned earlier about how some atheists will say, I didn't have a deconversion process, I had an enlightenment process where I got out of something that was wrong or false. I don't mind I just care about the intention behind the way people act. The words don't have to be perfect. But if we want to say that I lost my faith, I'd give many reasons. I get asked that frequently.
Right.
I would say a lot of them were intellectual reasons. I had,
right.
I was studying, sort of pretty advanced philosophical issues, theological issues, historical issues, things like the biblical text or justifications for the existence of God, historical issues with hermeneutics and how people interpret the text. You name it. I've kind of gone through all those intellectual issues, but it wasn't just intellectual, right? Because as John was mentioning, referring to height, we're not robots, right? We're not computers, right? We're not as rational as we want to believe. So a lot of it was that it also just kind of didn't fit with who my inner personality, and also kind of maybe my lifestyle even. I mean, right. I'm not cussing right now, but I usually cuss like a sailor. Even as a Christian, that was such a hard thing. Like I just naturally want to cuss, and there's other issues, like it's just basically like Puritanism just doesn't fit with me in any way, shape, or form. Like,
that made the movement to Reformed theology really tough, didn't it?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah. Well, at least they were cool with drinking beer and smoking cigars, right? So, but besides that, so I would say many different factors as towards why I lost my faith. I would say rational, intellectual stuff, but also heartfelt, emotional, personal reasons.
Yeah, I think Kyle has done a big service with that comment he just made, in that we got to understand the framework and the narrative that we're using to ask the questions and to respond. And I would say one that's recognized the frames. So the questioner says, how did you lose your faith? And from certain atheist perspectives, again, it's not a loss, it's a gain. And so it depends upon where you're coming from in this. And secondly, I would say it's okay to embrace your framework. I practice religious diplomacy. Don't be afraid of the fact of where you're coming from. Embrace that. It's yours. You want to persuade others. But at the same time, recognize it is a framework. And so the other person you're having a conversation with is going to see it very differently. And we need to be careful that we're speaking to each other and humanizing each other, even as we embrace those very different frameworks and perspectives. I've got my phone on over here with some of the comments, and I see them coming in, and some of them are kind of missing what we're trying to get at, I think, in the conversation.
Right.
Come at it from those frame kinds of perspectives.
Yeah, and I was thinking about some of those comments. They evidence a sense of, as a Christian, being responsible for somebody else's conversion. And that's something I've never quite understood. Despite the fact I understand a passion for communicating what I view as what is my truth, right? And I put it in those terms. I view it as truth, but you guys aren't going to say that everything I believe is right. So it's not, you're not agreeing with me on that. And although I have a passion for communicating that, I don't have any sense of responsibility or feeling that I have the power to convert somebody. And if I do convert somebody, what are they converted to? Me? Man, that's really problematic.
So Phil, how do you respond to the whole, go and make disciples?
So that partially fits into my whole view of leadership and following somebody. I don't think I can be a good leader and demand loyalty, fealty, that belief in me, that has to happen relationally. I'm believed in because I'm trusted, because I've proven myself, I've shown myself, not because I have a title or I'm in a position. And I've had a tendency over the course of my life as a whole to view any kind of identification with a person because of their fame or their position, their title, really skeptically. And that includes when people do it to me. So there's a couple instances where, maybe I've appeared on some movie and they went, wow, that was really amazing. And it's Phil Wyman. And on the inside, I kind of have a creepy feeling. I have a problem with yes men, so the conversion happens internally, and the discipleship happens because people say, I want to be a part of this. And I go, cool, follow me. I'm going to go over here. You want to go over here too? Instead of like a commanding thing,
Sure.
I view it as a, relational mentoring process. So when somebody says, go and make disciples, wow, that cannot be programmatically created and demanded, it's a life kind of experience. Jesus and his apostles were really a messy group of people. What are we going to do next? I don't know. Just go out and do it, guys.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm probably too much, I'm a little bit too anarchic, I suppose, for most people. But yeah, so when I see that command, I still look at it as a command, but I think it happens relationally.
Sure.
So
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And don't we have to be careful, Phil, not to conflate make converts with make disciples? I mean, we're not doing the conversion process, right? If someone says, hey man, I'm in, then I disciple, I bring them alongside. And in a sense, couldn't we also say, Kyle, that some atheists are interested in making disciples, right? We're trying to persuade others in the arena of ideas. We're trying to shape them and bring them along, within our worldview as we see it. So that discipleship process isn't necessarily, the same thing as conversion. And I think everybody does it to some extent.
Sure, I agree. Yeah, it's natural to, hold your beliefs about yourself in the world and want other people to agree with you. It gives us a sense of community, a sense of kind of like confirming our identity, making us not feel so ostracized, a sense of security and all of this. And of course, we want other people to think like we do. I mean, that's just sort of a natural impulse. But then there's also this idea that I've thought about for a while, is that one of the best parts of life, even though it's messy and trashy, is the fact that people are so different, right? Hell isn't other people, like Jean-Paul Sartre said, right? Hell is where everybody is like you. Like, you need that optimal tension between sameness and difference, right? If you have, if you're too similar, it's hell. I have a hard enough time liking myself. If I had a couple clones, I'd feel bad for them, So I don't want the world to like be like me, right? Like, not everyone has to believe what I believe. And also, sometimes we need to abandon our initial assumption and change it to be that someone may never be like you. And then the question is, if people are just never going to be like you or believe what you believe, what do you do then? Right. How do you act in the world if you just realize that the fact is people are not always going to agree about things? That's just, it's just the way we are.
Yeah, and that's how I actually got involved in this dialogue, multi-faith engagement thing. For years, I did the culturally sensitive evangelism thing, which I think has its place. But then I started asking myself, what do I do? How do I live as a faithful Christian in the midst of religious pluralism, where most people are going to choose not to embrace what I hold dear? How do I live faithfully in that without doing the evangelistic drive-bys, right? When somebody rejects my worldview, how do I embrace them as recognize their humanity, continue relationships, and work together despite our differences? And so, yeah, I'm with you. And I think evangelicals really struggle with that. And it's going to be even more so in a post-Trump era.
Oh boy.
Because, we're going to lose Christian privilege. And I want to make sure the audience hears me here, not Christian freedoms, but Christian privilege, where our place in the public square is no longer privileged, and minority religious traditions and atheism who've been clamoring to have their expression in the public square, where that starts to balance out more. I think the tendency for us is going to be to cry that our freedoms are being taken away and we can't go to church anymore and these kinds of things. We just don't know how to live in an environment where Christianity is not privileged. And that in part comes from the Christian nationalism narrative. But we have such a long way to go in grappling with a Christian ethic in place with a pluralistic kind of world.
Yeah, lack of privilege doesn't equal persecution, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know that of course I can pick on my own tribe of evangelicals in this sense, but I don't know that we as Americans particularly understand that, because we've tied what we call freedom to a set of particular benefits and privileges and economic issues, and there's all kinds of things where that comes into play, that we're in a very dangerous time because everybody feels like they're losing their privileges at the same time. And
I've always kind of been weird about the whole Christian nationalist idea of freedom being basically my property, my guns, and like my racist beliefs equal my freedom, because there's so many different ways to understand Christianity or interpret texts or interpret the biblical text, right? But I generally feel like this sense of like a more communitarian idea fits better with something like the early church than something like libertarianism. Like I cannot see like a libertarian Jesus, right? Like, or a libertarian Christian community. It to me, in what I at least somewhat conceive of as what Christianity amounts to, and once again, it's not monolithic, but I just simply can't imagine a poor suffering Jew who wants to build a community being for people who want to protect their private property with guns and threats of violence. Like, it just seems so disconnected.
Right. So you had a post-colonialist communist reading of Acts chapter 2.
Well, to me, that just it doesn't even have to be communist. I mean, just some sort of like democratic socialism or something where your freedom isn't, having the right to be an independent asshole. Your freedom is realizing that your surviving and thriving is intricately bound up with everybody else's surviving and thriving. That is, there is a sense of a responsibility to the other, right? That I feel should be at the heart of Christianity.
Yeah. And that's having spent in the last, I don't even know how many years it is right now, but certainly more specifically within the last 4 to 5 years, time with my anarchist Christian friends in the Czech Republic and my socialist Welsh nationalist friends in Wales. Those who want independence from the UK, which, plug tomorrow at 10 o'clock, I'm doing a podcast on that subject with the leader of Yes Cymru. So there's this fast growing movement. It's amazing to me. There's much more of a communally responsible sense of what freedom is for my friends who are, involved in these particular circles than we typically find with much of at least the noise of American evangelicalism right now that we find on the internet. So I agree with you completely. It seems like it ought to be at the heart of our Christianity, and yet that's at least not what we're getting across the internet.
Yeah, I'm curious too with John. I mean, how do you view Jesus in relationship to things like libertarianism, capitalism, or socialism? I'm curious.
Yeah, on the one hand, I get a little frustrated sometimes on Facebook, whether it's right or left, when Jesus gets appropriated to confirm a particular set of political assumptions, right?
Yeah.
You need to take Jesus on his own terms, in his own context, and then try and connect the dots, allowing for very different contexts and assumptions and these kinds of things. But having said that, I agree with you completely. I've come to the conclusion that American evangelicals in particular have failed to practice a cruciform spirituality. I mean, the crazy thing is, at the heart of the early Christian movement, you have this Christian movement based upon a crucified criminal, a shameful way of death, designed by Rome to say, this guy isn't what you think he is. He's a pretender to the throne. Caesar rocks, and we're going to enforce it by violence. And they come out and say, hey, wait a minute. This was actually a power that was shown through weakness. And Paul develops that and says, we have to take up our cross. So there's this cruciform, self-emptying, loving the other, caring, putting others first. All of this is at the heart of early Christianity, and it's not, in my estimation, at the heart of my evangelicalism. We have been interested in holding on to political power, holding on to Christian privilege at the expense of other religious traditions. We have minimized or neglected important aspects of our religious tradition, like care for the immigrant and these kinds of things. And so I think we've got to get in touch with the essence of the basics of our religious tradition and our historical origins and start living that out again. So since Phil gave a podcast promo, after the first of the year, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Michael Gorman, who has written a couple of books on cruciform spirituality of the Apostle Paul. And I'm going to connect the dots to what does that look like in our context with other religious traditions? How does focusing on the cross help us do things like reapproach love, reapproach how we read our own sacred text, how we relate to the other? And my hope is that we will hopefully not become retrenched post-Trump, but actually be self-critical and start thinking about what is a better way forward. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's my hope.
Yeah. Wow. So that actually, it makes me a question or an approach to these things I often have is, I want the outsider to speak into my Pentecostal, evangelical, whatever it is, my forming Christianity. I don't almost feel like I don't have a tribe anymore. With the variety of things that I've gone through.
Well, you're carnivalesque, right?
That's right. And and part of that Bakhtinian carnivalesque, Bakhtin's view of the many voices speaking into for him it was the novel. He had the view that others understood ourselves better than we do. Now, I certainly believe that's true. It may have a limited capacity, because we can't judge another's heart. But on the other hand, if it's true that what we speak betrays who we are, and how we act betrays who we are, that, out of the mouth, as Jesus would say. If that's true, then other people do read us well, and that goes culturally as well. So another tribe understands my tribe better than I do. So the changing dynamics of evangelical Christianity, Kyle, what do we look like right now?
Oh, wow.
And you're in Arizona, bro.
That's really, that's setting up just like the perfect throw of the baseball for me to just knock it right out of the park.
Out of the park. I know.
So, well, being in Arizona has been difficult. It's been kind of like a culture shock for me. I mean, I lived in California, Washington, New York, Boston, Glasgow, Germany. Very liberal, very progressive, coastist, you know. So coming into a sort of, I'm really happy that the state turned blue this election season. And once again, we don't have to get too much into politics, but the evangelical Trump cult of personality, I would probably say, is just, it's astounding to me. It kind of mesmerizes you that really what matters to some of these people is it has nothing to do with you know, a poor immigrant Jew, you know, a couple thousand years ago. It has everything to do with their political identity and their nationalism. So what comes first is not their religious convictions. What comes first is their worry about, you know, their current privilege in society. Also their unfounded fears that, you know, people are, it's always some sort of paranoia, right? The government's going to take our guns. They're socialists and they're going to take our private property. The immigrants are coming in and they're all gangsters and drug dealers, and it's always a fear of the other. It's always a marginalizing of other people. It's a fascist form of Christian nationalism, and let's just be real, it's disgusting. I mean, it's intellectually inept. I'm sorry, but if I can speak clearer sentences than the president of the United States, then there's a problem, right? So that's me being nice, I guess. But now, once again, I don't want to lump all evangelicals together. I know that there's this movement within evangelicalism to kind of reevaluate itself in terms of how it relates to the state and how it relates to politics and how it relates to others. And so I do know people that identify as evangelical that are not Christian nationalists. They care about the other. They care about the poor, the immigrant, the suffering, etc. So really, you know, the idea of conversion and deconversion, those words are difficult. One of the most difficult words you can try to define right now is what an evangelical is. It's such a difficult, I mean, you're just going to get a million different answers to that. You know, so that's my quick response to Christian nationalism. But obviously I'm not lumping all Christians or evangelicals together as nationalists, you know.
That would be like us lumping all atheists into one category of aggressive,
I also want to reiterate, part of doing this sort of cross-belief dialogue is that I think one of the best principles that I've come across is that I don't want to compare the best of my tradition with the worst of somebody else's. Absolutely. So I don't want to say that Christianity has, you know, the Spanish Inquisition, the wars of Europe, you know, Christian nationalism and all this, and then say, oh, well, atheism has the Enlightenment, right? Human rights, all this stuff. Because what I'm doing is I'm comparing the worst to the best of mine. And I don't want them to do that to me. I don't want them to go, we have MLK, we have altruism, we have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and you have the reign of terror in France. You have Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao. You know, so it's a sense of being a sense of equity, of being fair to each other.
Right.
So I want to be fair to the other because I want the other to be fair to me.
Yeah, I think it was probably one of the first lessons I learned was that I needed to acknowledge almost apologetically those things that were part of the history and sometimes the current events of my own faith. You know, the people who called by the same names I call myself. And, and then when people would go on a diatribe listing things and throwing them at me, I would just nod my head and go, yep, 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 until they wound down. And say,
Sure.
hey, man, I totally agree with you, and I think it ought to be done differently. There was a this is an extremely funny moment when I was at a Druid. I think it was called Druid Camp. It was a little festival in the UK, and there were a group of us from church on the coast there, and we were doing dream interpretation and things like that. And some girl said to me at one point, What are you guys doing here? Christians aren't supposed to be at Druid Camp. And so, I just said, well, do you think Jesus would come to something like this? Now, this is a girl who's former Christian. Now she's a Druid. And she said, well, yeah, of course he would, but Christians aren't supposed to. And I just stared at her until she started laughing, and then we both laughed because that's the tension that we're in, and it's probably true of whatever position we're in. There's an ideal, and there's what we're living today, and then there's the extreme wrong. And yeah, I perhaps want to compare the extreme wrongs of my tribe with the extreme wrongs of your tribe, but the extreme goodness of my tribe with the extreme goodness of your tribe. Balance it all together. I mean, all those things are worth discussing, but not in the way that, you described it, comparing my best with your worst. And that's, boy, isn't that what we do? No matter where we're coming from. Sad world.
Yeah, I agree. I think, John, that's kind of what you're doing as well.
We'll try, and my hope is one of the challenges we face in this is that it's very difficult for us to hear the critique or the perspective of the outsider. Because so much of ourselves is tied into it, our community, our identity, what we cherish, what is sacred. Everybody sacralizes things that, that's it for them, man. That's the sacred. I would argue that even atheists do it in a non-theistic kind of sense, right? And when an outsider comes and says, hey, to me, you look like A, B, C, and D, like you were asked to do by Phil, that's a difficult pill to swallow. And the knee-jerk reaction is saying, what does this guy know? This is an atheist and blah, blah, blah. And then we start, rattling off all the assumptions that we have because they're the other. And what we're trying to do at Multifaith Matters, what Phil's trying to do with his work is say, look, we're not even self-critical, let alone willing to listen to the voice of the other. And it's really helpful for me. I love my dialogues with the so-called people on the margins, whether it's the atheist, the Muslim, or what have you, because it helps me. I benefit from how others see me and trying to understand my tribe and to be self-critical. And I like to think that I grow and develop and mature in my own faith, in addition to understanding where the other's coming from and how they practice their religion or their irreligion. And so there's a whole lot of, in my view, a whole lot of benefits if we would just open ourselves up to that other perspective. Doesn't mean you always have to embrace all of it, but at least be willing to hear it so that you can begin to kind of, examine yourself. But it's not an easy process.
Yeah. There's so much, this is one of the things, so Kyle, that John and I in the Multifaith Matters have struggled with is in certain circles of Christian interfaith work, the dialogue tends to be all about what we agree on, and we don't want to touch the things we don't agree on. So much to the case that there was one interfaith circle, this was in Salem, that included formerly, or maybe currently they would consider themselves part of a Christian worldview, but they actually went so far as to state that you couldn't use the J word in the group because it was too, they talk about Jesus and it's too dividing. So it was all talk about what we agree upon. And for me, if I talk with you and we find points of agreement and we understand our points of agreement, but I don't know how you differ from me, particularly on very fundamental issues, then I haven't met you.
Mhm.
I've only met me in you.
Yeah.
I'm only creating a mirror image for which I can, have my little echo chamber of life. So in order to discover you, I've got to find these radical differences. And so for me, I find myself incredibly bored with a world where everybody disagrees with me.
Mhm.
I want out of it right away. I shiver when I drive through Tulsa, Colorado Springs. Let me out of here. I need some good pagans.
Sure.
I need somebody in which to dialogue about the hard stuff of life. And
Well, and I agree absolutely. So we're pretty much all on the same page here, us three, basically trying to find ways to positively work with people from different perspectives.
yeah,
But we also cannot gloss over radical differences. I mean, so Stephen Prothero, a religious studies professor at Boston University, coined this term called pretend pluralism, right? And it's basically
wow.
just like a superficial form of singing kumbaya, right? So I've done a lot of interfaith work, right, as an atheist, which is, unique in its own way. And a lot of times it's been a bunch of just, propping up everyone and saying, hey, we're all good. We all practice the golden rule. We're all going to try to help the homeless, blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
He also wrote a book called God Is Not One, basically dissecting that everyone has this very different view of God, even, in the same church, in the same Bible study group, each person has a radically different view of God, right?
Yeah.
So we don't want to do pretend pluralism. So we want to actually engage in radical difference. And so, I'm willing to always say, when asked and when appropriate, I'm willing to tell someone my honest beliefs about certain things.
Right.
And they will disagree. I mean, I don't believe a God exists. I don't believe there's a heaven or a hell. I don't believe there's a soul. I don't believe in miracles. I don't believe, I mean, you name it. I'm basically what someone might refer to as like a scientific materialist.
What?
Right.
I'm out of this conversation. I had no idea.
Yeah. So, but here's the thing. Like, I mean, that obviously makes sense, right? An atheist doesn't believe in God. It's kind of, axiomatic, right? Sort of in the name itself. But I think even within Christianity or any religious tradition, I think it's just within any group of people, we need to be willing to be authentic about our differences, at like an atomic level. Like, there's parts where we're just like, we disagree at the atomic level, so I agree. Let's not do pretend pluralism either.
Yeah. So we're at about an hour 15. We've been hanging out with each other here, and so there's a whole bunch of things, and you just listed a bunch of them, Kyle, that like it'd be great to talk about. The debates of the soul, and is there a deity, and all of those things, all the dynamics of radical materialism. Versus supernatural view of the world that wackos like myself have. But you're
I'm glad you called yourself that. See, I didn't call you that.
yeah, well, you're wacko.
I may believe it, but I didn't call you it.
Oh, I know you believe it. You have told me that in the past, so I know it's true.
That would make for, maybe we do this again. It might be interesting. Kyle, I don't know if you've heard of the position of non-reductive physicalism.
Yes.
Where some evangelicals have argued that we don't need to posit a soul or a spirit, that we can account for human beings and human uniqueness with reference to the brain and its processes and this kind of thing. So, as much as I might like to think Christians have to believe in a soul and atheists don't, it's, again, even that process is messy and complicated. So
yeah.
unpack there.
I agree.
It's really
So
messy.
I think, yeah, and I do have to head here, but I do think we should do this again.
Yeah.
It would be good. So my buddy Andrew from Wales says, great debate, guys. Christians and atheists united under common grace. So thank you for everybody who's been watching. And Kyle, thank you. John, thank you. It's, it's totally awesome. It's great connecting with you again after so many years here, Kyle.
You too, Phil. And John, it's been a pleasure, man.
Yeah.
I've
This has been Wild Theo. Go ahead.
No, I've been familiar with your work, Kyle, but not with you connected with it. They invite an atheist to church, so it's great to connect.
Yeah. So there's been Wild Theology, John Morehead, Kyle Jones, and me, Phil Wyman. And you can check in tomorrow at 10 o'clock California time, and we'll be talking about Welsh independence with Sean Jobbins. So anyway, thank you, everybody.